Good evening, everyone. Good evening. What is it about a beach or the use and ownership of that brings out a crowd, even on a beautiful summer evening like today? Welcome, everyone, and welcome to Who Owns the Beach? Investigations into historical ownership of the Maine coast. My name is Paul Ness, and I'm the director here at the Wells Reserve. There's a little bit of background. For about 3 years now, the Wells Reserve has teamed up with a variety of organizations, including the Maine Coastal Program, Maine Sea Grant, and the town of Wells, to delve into the issue of the coast. Who owns it? Who has rights to it? Where do they derive their rights to own it? Where do they derive their rights to use it? We started about 3 years ago with a debate, actually at the Maine Beaches Conference, and Ben Leone from Curtis Saxter, right in the back, was the very first person who we partnered with, Ben and Amy Chow, in which they discussed the finer points of Goose rocks. Very fascinating, very good discussion, and very good debate. And that kicked off a whole series of events here at the Wells Reserve and also at the University of Maine School of Law that really looked into this issue. And we presented both sides. They were all cordial, great, intelligent discussions. And we believe through this series of probably about 6 different events, people got a better understanding of this issue. At an event, or actually a couple of events, 2 years ago, a couple of lectures and presentations, a man by the name of Peter Moody got up and spoke passionately about ownership and about where ownership in the colonial period throughout Wells' early history, where that ownership started and where it ended. It was very thorough and thoughtful comments that he made over a couple of meetings. Afterwards, we met with Peter Moody, John Carter, and Mike Livingston from the town of Wells, and went over some of his research. And what we saw there was not someone who was just raving about his thoughts. He was actually basing his words on research that he did, painstaking research over years that had to take him months and months of work. And we just felt that it was something to be taken seriously. We wanted to look further into this issue. And we did. We felt that maybe we could write a grant, Town of Wells and the Wells Reserve, to explore this issue further. So we wrote a grant application, and the Maine Coastal Program funded it. And we sent out a request for proposals, and a number of individuals and organizations submitted proposals. And we awarded it to Maine Boundary Consultants, who worked on this project for about 6 months or so, working many more hours than what we compensated them for. And they were very interested in the subject matter. And a result of that is a report that looks at ownership of the beach. Where do landowners, some landowners, they didn't look at all deeds, of course, that would take years. Where did they derive their title? What was the premise of Mr. Moody's thesis? What was that based on? So they really delved into the deeds and the history here in Wells. And the result of that is a report called Coastal Beach Land Deed Research. And it's a 100-page document. We have the executive summary. I think it's about 8 pages or so with the timeline that's on the back table. And if we run out, let me know and we will get you more copies. We will have the copies on the Town of Wells website, a PDF version, as well as on the Wells Reserve website. So, let me know if you're interested in the 100-page document and see about getting that to you. I would like to acknowledge our partners in this project. One is John Carter, town manager, and Mike Livingston, town engineer and planner. And also I want to acknowledge the funders of this project, the Maine Coastal Program, which is located at the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry, as well as the town of Wells. Before we delve in, before I introduce our speakers tonight, the researchers, the project team, if you are interested in this subject, I want to give you a heads up about a publication that is coming out in about a month's time. It's the 3rd edition of the Public Shoreline Access in Maine, a Citizen's Guide to Ocean and Coastal Law. It's authored by John Duff, who's a law professor at the University of Massachusetts, formerly of the University of Maine School of Law. It takes a look at the various court cases and interprets things. Essentially, what do these court cases mean for landowners? What do they mean for people who want to get to the shoreline? So that will be coming out shortly. And go to the wellsreserve.org website, look for my name, and I'd be happy to make sure that you get a copy. We'll also have a PDF version on the website, I would say in about a month's time. So with that, I would like to present the project team, if you will, the two individuals that spent a lot of time in this project over the last 6 months. The first one is Robert Urumian. And Robert, I know I didn't quite get that right once again. But if anything, I establish a pattern and stick with it. Robert is a licensed surveyor and founder and owner of Maine Boundary Consultants, which is located in Buxton. In addition to land surveying services for a range of clients, Robert and his staff delve deep into deeds. They love it. They get into the complicated deed research, often tracing partial ownership going back over 300 years. A perfect complement to a surveyor is an historian, and along with Robert, that's Dr. Edwin Churchill, who is currently an independent historical and museum consultant. With a PhD in history from the University of Maine, Edwin was for many years the chief curator at the Maine State Museum in Augusta, a really fine institution, as well as he taught history at a number of universities. His area of specialty is early New England colonial history, with, of course, a Maine emphasis. So I'm going to turn it over to Robert and Edwin.
If you can't hear me, speak up, because I tend to be a little soft sometimes when I'm speaking. Just very quick background, I've been suffering over this history of early Maine coastline and communities since the late 1960s. I'm definitely a bit older now. And so I thought the thing we probably ought to do is kind of look at how we got to where we are in terms of land ownership and the processes that Wells, as many other Maine towns, went through in the 17th century and early 18th century. One of the first things I ought to point out, that probably some of you know, but maybe not all, is when the first settlers came over here, when the first grants were given, these were not freeholds like we think of today. They were leaseholds. In other words, all land was owned by the king. And then he distributed it to someone who then distributed beyond. And so it went through a level of proprietors until you got to a local landowner in Wells. There were three really major types of proprietors to think about that were grants from the king. Two of them, one was called the Council for New England, and they gave grants to the second level proprietors like in Saco, in Scarborough, and a variety of other Maine coast towns. The other major proprietor, and the one that is of interest to you people, was Sir Fernando Gorges. And he was given a grant to Maine in 1639. And so the grants that we see here came through him, or from him, through his nephew, Thomas Gorges. Now, one of the things we have to realize is all of these grants were leaseholds. So Sir Fernando Gorges, what he had to pay the king every year for Maine was 1/5 of all the gold that they mined here. And also 1/5 of all the pearls they found here. Well, when I ran into that, I thought, what are they talking about? Well, there's a good reason. If you know the mid-Maine coast, there are these great oyster beds that were left here by the Indians in about 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. Well, I'm sure that's what they saw. Well, 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, things were a lot warmer in Maine. The ocean was warmer, the climate was warmer. So they were looking at fossil oyster shells and decided, my gosh, this is a really good place to get oysters. So I don't think they got much money out of Gorges. Well, then he gave one grant to Thomas Gorges, 5,000 acres in, next door here. I've gone quick, thank you. See, I keep him around to keep me on but Thomas never took that up. And the big grant came in 1643, and that was a grant to John Wheelwright, Henry Bode, and Edward Wishwood for the town that we now know as Wells. And they were the original commissioners. They were given the rights by this grant to lay out the land, or to give land to various people, and they, or later commissioners, because some of them left, some of them were replaced, served that purpose. And in those initial grants, they too had leasehold, what they call quit claims, or fees that they were owed, and their fee was to be a portion of whatever they charged the man who they sold land to, plus any land they themselves improved. What was interesting about all of this with the leaseholders was that this system died very quickly because Gorges not only gave this grant to them, but there were 6 other deeds that he gave to other people in Wells. And each of them carried with them this fee, or this quit rate. But as the commissioners handed out the land, only one of them, one deed that they ever gave out, contained these quit rents. So they very quickly went to what we call a freehold, or a warranty deed today, a deed without obligations. And what most people don't realize was how fast these New Englanders wanted to get away from control of England. In fact, even before 1643, before Wheelwright's grant, Massachusetts had made a law, put out an act, that said all of these medieval things like sausage, fealty, fees, would not be accepted on any of their deeds. Well, guess what? They figured that was sounded pretty good in Maine as well. And so the king was counted out very, very early. Now, this system of commissioners handing it out went on from about 43 to 48. And then there came a major action. Massachusetts, who most people don't realize, was a major imperialist power back then. They, for example, they picked up Plymouth. They tried to get Rhode Island. They were after land in Vermont. They managed to get their claws into some degree to New Hampshire. And then they looked east. But, let's see if this one gives us, nope, next one. There. What they did, their charter said that their land ended 3 miles north of the Merrimack. Well, that certainly doesn't get you to Maine. However, if you look at that and say, well, that really means 3 miles from the northernmost part of the Merrimack River, all of a sudden, you're heading, I think this next one may have an even better. You see, you're heading way up there to the head of the Merrimack, and then they draw the line straight across. They said, oh my gosh, this all belongs to us. And immediately moved to the next, all of Maine. They said they would, as soon as they got this line drawn, and of course this is not document made at all, but that's how they interpreted it. As soon as they got the line drawn, they immediately, as you can see, they took Kittery, and then in the next year after doing some heavy politicking, because one of the things that not everybody was enthused with this idea in Maine, so they very quickly built up through letters and get-togethers to get all the people in this area, including a couple members from Wells, to write letters to Massachusetts saying, oh my goodness, you've got to come here this winter. And so they show up in July of 1653, and they take in Saco, Wells, and Cape Porpoise, or what we now know as Kennebunk Point. And they really changed the whole thing. Number one, the first statement was, now that you're a part of us, part of Massachusetts, you will have the same rights and privileges of all Massachusetts towns. They also said, because this was a key point, they said very carefully that all deeds that you own, whether it's from the town, whether it's from gorges, whether it's from Massachusetts, are all valid. And of course, what that did is it wiped out a tremendous amount of what could have been real opposition to the whole thing. They further went on and said for the first time, at least I think it's the first time, they appointed selectmen for the town of Wells and also commissioners to handle court cases. So basically, this was the document wherein Massachusetts solidified and verified the town of Wells as an entity, including not only just the lands that were already given, but all the lands that were town lands as well. So that is a major document, a major event, several documents. And we see that shows up within about a year, because in 1654, there's a land grant, which was given to a gentleman here in Wells by the commissioners, i.e. the Wheelwright Bunch, and selectmen of Wells granted the land together. And as far as I can see, here's the transfer from commissioners to selectmen. Massachusetts had said the town of Wells is an entity in and of itself under our jurisdiction. They gave the authority at that point. And the next year, you see the commissioners and selectmen making this document. And after that, it goes on continuous that the selectmen or freemen of Wells, one of those two groups, every town record we have which indicates how that record was made, how that document deed was made, was one of those two groups. And this continues through the century until we get to 1680. And there's a gentleman named William Frost comes to town, and he was given land by the inhabitants of Wells, totally different configuration. And I spent a long time thinking about what was going on. Well, this is during the Indian Wars. And Wells, along with all the other communities, were really traumatized. They saw everybody east of them during these wars were stopping there and then going further west. And until ultimately, Wells was the end of the line. There was no more settlement further east. And so you have a community that's scared to death. They're talking about leaving. They just don't know when the next attack is coming. And what this deed shows, is, I believe, is the inhabitants now wanted to make sure that William Frost felt he was part of the community. And so it made a lot more sense in a period when there were no police and there were no real methods of handling problems like this legally. They wanted to make sure that he felt welcome. And so with the inhabitants, we all welcome you. And that seems to be what was going on in this situation. And it's hard to really feel the fear and anguish, because Wells during Queen Anne's War had been attacked viciously, but had managed through their fortifications to hold the Indians off, to hold the natives off. At the beginning of Queen Anne's War, which was 1703, there was an attack on August the 10th of this whole region, several communities, for example, Kennebunkport or Cape Pork was wiped right off the map. Wells did not get wiped off, but it had something like 39 people either killed or captured in that one raid. Well, that's a tremendous amount of people to suddenly lose in a small community. And then they were continuously attacked all through the war, little raids, catch somebody out on the highway, catch somebody out in the fields, and ultimately they even, right at the end of the war, were able to raid a wedding party, ran off with the groom, killed some people. They actually were able to ransom the groom. So you can have an idea now how what this meant just psychologically. What it also meant is now there were land holdings with nobody around. They were either killed off, they ran for their lives and didn't come back, and then new people were beginning to show up. So it was really chaos, and trying to deal with all of that was a major, major problem that you always got to figure into what's happening here. And just so that wasn't enough, Maine has the ability to provide one of the most ridiculous political histories that you possibly have. For example, Massachusetts finally took over. That worked all good. That was in 1653. Well, in 1664, the Crown said, no, Gorge's deed, the original deed, belonged to him, to his heirs. And essentially we're saying, you're out of here, Massachusetts. Well, that was not a good thing for them as far as that goes, but for the people of Maine, it meant all of a sudden, here would come a new political unit which would demand that they retitle, everybody's title would have to be redone. And of course that would have cost them money. Everybody was going to have to pay fees or quit rents from 1639 to present, as well as present quit rent, which would have probably broke half of it monetarily. So that battle went on for a couple of years. Massachusetts finally kicked them out. And just by the time that they thought they could breathe a little bit, you have a bunch of royal commissioners show up and just take Maine away from Massachusetts and then leave. So the people again are in limbo for about 3 years, and Massachusetts just finally comes out. It's over again. Okay, well that's good. And so Maine then was under Massachusetts for the next, well, let's see, 8 years. And then again, the king comes through, no, Gorge's grant is still good, and you're going to have to give it back. Well, this left them in a quandary, because not only would they have to, all of these problems that Gorge's people would cause, but this would mean that they had a royal colony next door. And if there's anything Massachusetts hated, it was a royal colony. They wanted to be independent. So they were in a quandary, what to do. And finally they figured it out. They thought, well, you know, why don't we just buy the charter, Gorge's charter? Well, they knew if they do that, the king would have just gone off at the deep end. So they sent a guy by the name of Usher, who was a past treasurer down in Massachusetts, who bought Gorge's charter. He then immediately sold it to Massachusetts. Good old money laundering was going right on in those days too. And needless to say, the king was outraged, but he really wasn't able to do a whole lot about it. So now Massachusetts decided they would treat Maine as their colony. Not as a part of Maine, but they're their colony. And so anybody who had a deed that traced back to Gorge's, they would have to start paying these fees or quit rents. And everybody else, if they didn't have to be able to trace back that, if they came from the town or otherwise, that was okay. They charged them a fee too. So they're right back in the kettle. And so this went on for a number of years. And then once again, they create something called the Dominion of New England. And this was an large body covering all the way from New York to Maine. And for most of them, it was just trying to get it in control, start controlling the illegal trade. But for Maine, they were focused on them. They were going to take this away from Massachusetts. And so you had total disruption for several years. And then, once again, they disappeared, and Maine was again a colony of Massachusetts. Now, there is a test at the end of this. So, it went on like this. They never knew whether their titles were there when the Dominion was there. Andrews, who was the governor under this Dominion in New England, was actually coming to Maine, especially like Portland, and making people pay for new titles. Maybe it was just their cantankerous behavior or something, but Wells never did, at least as far as we know. They did not go to him to buy and get a new title. Well, anyhow, it all came to an end in 1692, because in 1692, the king created Maine as part of Massachusetts in a royal colony, said your titles are good, and that was kind of the end of that. They finally had secure titles. Let's see what else. Yeah, and then we see one more round. And this was a major change that takes place in Maine land granting between the end of the wars and 1613, which was the end of, literally, end of Queen Anne's War. And that's when the clerk records began. I believe that's the year. And we see the town granting now being done by the freemen and other inhabitants at a legal meeting. So that's, didn't know quite what to make of that, because freemen I understood, they would automatically people to vote. But what about these other inhabitants? But that's what they read. And then comes the deed of 17, 15, 16. In March of that year, or 17, 16 as we think of it now. And that was when they created the Board of Proprietors. And this is probably one of the most interesting documents in Wells' history, and for a whole variety of reasons. In 1713, 3 years before, Massachusetts had created this whole system of boards of proprietors, a major act. And I think it came about in part because of the wars, in part because the people who were left were trying to get control because they saw a lot of newcomers coming into the community. Also because some of the old timers, equally concerned about all of these newcomers, wanted to make sure that they had control of the land and it wasn't taken over by a bunch of new bodies and new people who might vote against it. And so I think that was what is involved, because in that time period, numerous communities immediately started boards of proprietors. In other words, let's keep the thing in our hands. Another thing that I finally found out, because that one said, the vote would be by the freemen and other inhabitants as per the law. Okay, that meant I started looking to see what in the world the law was. Well, I found in 1692, the law read that inhabitants could vote in the town meeting if, during when they did the rating for taxes, if they were rated at 20 pounds or more. In other words, the only inhabitants that they were allowing to vote were people who owned land. So that's what that means. The freemen and any other inhabitants that own land could vote at this meeting. So that kind of cleared that up. And the last thing that was very interesting, and we don't have an answer, I wish we did, is the vote to create the proprietorship was not unanimous. There was dissent. In fact, they had to have 2 meetings before they finally had that vote to do it. They had a meeting on the 20th of March, and they postponed it until the 27th. So you have a feeling that there were some people in town who really weren't in favor of But anyhow, that's what occurred, and it stayed that way for a long time. I didn't follow it far enough to find out when finally it was all people in town could vote, but I suspect that would probably be the late 19th or even 20th century. Well, that kind of leaves us what we got in terms of information regarding the deeds. But another thing that's said is the actual ownership and use of the beach. And it all builds out of the 1641 document, Act, Massachusetts, that the person who owned the land adjacent to the beach owned all the land to the low water mark, I think what 100 yards, I think it is, 100 lots, whatever it is. And the only other people allowed would be those involved in fishing, fowling, or navigation. Now, I suspect every one of you have heard that term, those terms. Well, that's very interesting, because there is only one instance that I have seen at this point in which that act ever was discussed in any court case, in the general court, or whatever. It's interesting because in the general court, they said, we have an application from a town, which they didn't name, unfortunately, asking whether, because this law is now in effect, whether we can't go on the beach or whether we are able to use the beach. Well, Massachusetts answered. And they said, it's up to you as the town to make that determination. So even at the time, they were not supporting their own act. They said, no, the town's got to make the decision. In other words, ignore the act. So next time we heard about that was Moody Beach. Okay. And the other thing is an act sometime not that long after. And it was an act on trespass. In other words, this is the whole issue of trespass and the argument that you couldn't go across that, which actually that 41 document would suggest. The later document describes trespass and what's involved. And the description includes only instances of damage. Trespass at that time meant damage. It did not mean walking across somebody's land. And that's in the general court records, an act they did. So it gives you a very different feeling of what's going on. And then, let's see what we got here. The other thing that we have to look at is the three exceptions, fishing, fowling, and navigation, were about the only economically viable reasons to have ownership of the beach. There were no other economic reasons for wanting it. The sand beach just wasn't important to them. And we, of course, see that by what it was important was travel. And there is document after document talking about the lower way, recollections talking about how they traveled on the beach, including Maine's first historian, James Sullivan, who was chased out of, I believe it was out of Berwick by the Indians, but he himself said, we used to travel on the beach. And there was good reason. Number one, it was easier, except of course you had to have ferries, and sometimes you have to wait till the tide is out, but that's all taken into effect. But the other reason was it's a lot harder for you to be caught by the Indians out on the beach than it is if you're traveling in through the woods. And over Maine towns were told you need to do an upper way, i.e. get above the tidal waters and that. They wouldn't do it. I've got a stack of documents like that. And they tell them, you Saco, you Wells, you create that upper way. And they just wouldn't, because it was too easy and too safe not to. And finally, the one reason that this last thing that I want to point out was they were very, very careful in the management of that sand. Because if that got into the marshes, it would destroy the marshes. You had to keep that seawall intact. You had to keep the marsh grass growing there. And in fact, I think it was in 1757, the town of Wells, Massachusetts actually voted for the town of Wells that you couldn't raise animals on the seawall or on the beach. You couldn't destroy that grass, because if you destroy it, the ocean and the sands come in. So that's kind of a real look at it. I'll let my partner here, Butch, talk about the actual physical
Pretty much that's it.
Thank you, Ed, very much. It's been a real pleasure working with Ed. There's so much a land surveyor can do, and what was interesting for me was when I was doing this research is I kept on finding these deeds coming from various people, like the Wells commissioners, the inhabitants, and stuff like that. And he kind of put an answer to those questions. And also, there was the question of Wells and the town itself and the inhabitants of Wells on who were the original landowners for this area. And most of the other parts of the state of Maine, most of the land, the source of title comes from some type of proprietorship, some type of individual or some type of an organization, and not necessarily a town or the inhabitants. So Wells is fairly unique in that way. And as a result of this, one of the goals that we needed to do with this research project was to figure out who and what is the source of the land grants. Whether or not if it was from an individual person, if it was from Andrew Gorges, whether or not if it was from the inhabitants of the town, or the proprietors, and were the proprietors part of the town, and stuff like that. Clearly, it was from the town inhabitants was the original landowners, and I'll kind of go through what I found with all that aspect of it. But I do want to mention just a couple of, give you some visual ideas. I think everybody is familiar with Wells and the coastline. Wells has a very, very unique coastline compared to the other places in the state of Maine, where we have these barrier islands or these beaches way out in towards the ocean, and then we have some marshes, and then we have what's called the uplands. And without a doubt, in Maine, if you own next to the sea, by law, if you have a deed that says that you own to the Atlantic Ocean, you own to the low water mark. That is rare throughout the entire country. There's only a few other places in the country where the private landowners own beyond towards the ocean below the high water mark. So Maine is unique in that way. So the colonial ordinance gave ownership to the low water mark. But however, in order to have that ownership, one has to be deeded that through the source of title. And from the research that we did, we don't see that coming out, and I'll kind of go through that a little bit. So the other thing back to say is, on the other parts of the state and the coast, what you have is you have the ocean coming in, and you have what's called the intertidal zone, which is where the tide fluctuates. And beyond the intertidal zone coming inland is a thing called the seawall. And the seawall is defined as a steep banking that separates the intertidal zone with the upland. And the upland is the land that is above any tides, any super high tides or something like that. And it's the upland that was originally granted out when there was grants that were made. And so picture other coastlines that you've seen. Quite often, the distance between the low water mark and the upland on a bold, rocky coastal place in the state of Maine is maybe less than from here to the wall, or just a few hundred feet at the most, or something like that. But here in Wells, there's almost a mile of land, of marshes and stuff like that. And picture a profile, a cross-section. So at first we have the sea, and then we have the sandy beach area. And within the sandy beach area, there's two classifications of the sandy beach area. There's what's called the wet sand and the high dry sands. And then the next level, next inland is a seawall. And then in different sections along Wells, we had a barrier, island type thing, and on behind the seawall is also marshlands, and in some places we have marshlands, and then we have a river, and then we have more marshes, and then we finally have the uplands. So there was a significant amount of land that separates the upland from the ocean. And in 1658, the inhabitants got together and voted to allow 18 present, the current inhabitants, another 100 acres of land each. So what happened was, and how land was created, everybody knows today that I can give you a deed to a piece of property and I can sign it. I'm the grantor and you're the grantee, and I sign over a piece of paper and you go record and register your deed. That's the transfer of ownership. In the beginning, they had what was called grants. And a grant was when the holder of the land would grant somebody, say, 100 acres of land. And quite often when that grant was made, it wasn't specifically placed on the face of the earth. It was just, I have a 100-acre grant, and I had a certain time period to do what's called a layout, to go out there and find it and lay it up. Sometimes they were done at the same time, sometimes they were done many years later. Some of the research I found, some of these layouts were done almost 30, 40, 50 years later, or generations later. So they would identify it later as a layout. And then the other thing that happened that we find, which is somewhat unknown, because of what Ed was talking about, because of all the unknown sources of title, because people left and left their property and never came back, there was this call from the inhabitants and later on from the proprietors to confirm people's properties. And there was calls for, at certain times when you had to come to the proprietors meeting at a certain date, bring your claim of land, and we will confirm it. We will confirm this layout or land grant that you might have had or you might have inherited that came 30, 40, 50 years later, maybe generations later. Sometimes these grants were transferred to other people, and somebody would get a grant of 100 acres from somebody. They would give the grant to somebody else, and somebody else would come in and say to the inhabitants of the town and say, I want this laid out now. Let's go find it on the face of the earth. The other thing that is also unique that a lot of people will not understand this is in that time period, every grant, usually it was 50 acres or 100 acres or 200 acres, came with a marsh. It came with a 5-acre, 10-acre, 20-acre marshland. The marshlands were very, very, very valuable. They were just as valuable, if not more valuable, than the land itself. Because there was already feed for the animals, there were statues to make buildings with, And so they didn't have to go in to the land and clear the land and grow the hay and have hay for the animals. The marshlands was already there. And one of the things that they did is when they granted these marshes, they would just say 100 acres of upland and 10 acres of marsh. But they wouldn't identify where it is. And sometimes what they would do is they would say something like, a place convenient to the marsh as may be, or of a meadow if it may be found out of any man's propriety. So one of the things that I found is they did not have these later layouts of these marshes. In other words, they didn't come back to the town and have them identified on the face of the earth. And so these marshes were somewhat open, and I would assume that if you had a 10-acre marsh in 1680, you would go down to the marsh and you know that neighbor John is over there and nobody's working with this piece of land. I'm going to go work this piece of land here. And they also traded, they also swapped, and they probably forgot about them, and they didn't use them and stuff like that. So the marshes were very important. And then once they started to become conveyed, all of the deeds that I looked at for the marshes, if there was a call for a boundary line towards the water, it was always the seawall. Never did I see a marsh that was bounded by the beach, or bounded by the Atlantic Ocean, or bounded by the sea, which tells me that they limited it to the seawall. And there's going to be a question of what seawall were they talking about? Were they talking about the front seawall, or were they talking about the back seawall, the interior seawall that's next to the marshes? And so more or less keep that in mind too. In 1713 and 1715, this is after, which is what more or less what Ed finished up. During that time period, there was 34 or so grants made to people in Wells by the inhabitants for 50 acres or 100 acres of upland and so many acres of marshes and stuff like that. In 1716, the town created the proprietors. And it was a time period when the town started getting together. The town had their own things that they had to deal with. And from what Ed was talking about, there was a call by Massachusetts for the towns to make these proprietors. And the proprietors were the proprietors of the town of Wells. They weren't a couple of individuals or businessmen or somebody from Boston or somebody from England. They were the inhabitants of the Wells that were proprietors. And they basically gave the proprietors the right and propriety of all the common and undivided land in the town. And so after 1716, it was the proprietors who were creating the grants and doing the layouts. I went through all of the proprietors' records from about 1716 to about 1780 or so. Dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of layouts and grants and stuff like that. One or two, maybe, says something about the sea. None, a few of them talks about marshes, but most of, during that time period, all of the coastal areas had been already conveyed out. This map here is in 1794. The Massachusetts legislature ordered everybody, all the towns, to make a map of their towns. They needed something. This is the Wells map. And this is a blow-up of the coastal area. Down in here is Ogunquit. This is Webb Hammock River right in here. And up in here is Coastal Parsons Beach. And what's really interesting about this map, a couple of things. One is, what does it say up here? It says, all this blank strip is a beach of white sand. So in 1794, that's all that it was. And it's showing on there a road right here, going right along the seawall, the area, the island area, and stuff like that. It shows the upper road that Ed was talking about, right up in here. And these little symbols here have to do with mills and stuff like that. The other thing that it shows, which is kind of interesting, is a big area right up in here that's labeled salt marshes. And it also says that this is the town river, right here, and this is the town rock. These are kind of clues that I had to say, well, geez, the source of title is coming from the town and stuff like that, and it's clearly there. You add up all these things and it's clearly right there. Now, when they originally started conveying out land in the 1600s, from 1640s to about 1680s, there was a series of what's called the Old Town Lots. And again, this is pretty much Ogunquit area right here. And here is the one where the Drake's Island, Wells Beach, Moody Beach, and stuff like that. When you look at all of the conveyances that were made in the 1600s, these lease holding, these other grants made by the inhabitants or the proprietors or the laws commissioners of these chunks of land, this is where they all fall. And when you look at them, they describe a strip of land that is so wide, so many rods wide, that would start at what was called the foot line of wells, which is roughly around Route 1, and they would extend into the country 2.5 miles to the headline. And so all the people up until the 1700s, the original landowners, these are the chunks of land that they were being granted and laid out. Plus, they got marshes. But where the marshes were of those individual people were not really clearly defined and described. And it's very difficult to put them on the face of the earth. And so, and some of them, when they were created, they said they would extend from the foot line towards the river or towards the marsh or towards somebody else's property or something like that. So they did extend beyond the Route 1 and they went down to the marshes, but very rarely did these original town lots extend much into the marshes, and they didn't necessarily, from what I can tell, extend straight across the marshes all the way to the islands, the beaches, and to the ocean. It just wasn't there. It's just not there. And so then when you start looking at the marshes and how were they described and where those boundaries are, what I found was that quite often they were just described as a 4-acre marsh. Sometimes they might say a 4-acre marsh next to John Smith's marsh. Sometimes they would say it was bounded by the river, or the island, or the seawall. But never were they saying to the Atlantic Ocean or anything like that at all. Also, there were these clues reading some of these records where it talked about the town marshes, the town commons. I think the town commons is something somebody might be familiar with, Boston Commons. But in reality in Wells, when they talked about the commons, they were talking about all this other land that was not deeded out to somebody in a grant or a layout. It was all common land. And again, there were some indications in some of the things that I read that talked about the town marshes. That somebody had certain rights to go and maintain the town marshes and stuff like that. Now, what I also want to mention is, back to the proprietors a little bit, is in 1720, the proprietors granted 20 for 30 lots. By this time, again, these lands were not necessarily in along the old town lots. There was a lot of stuff that was conveyed out along the river, up on the Mousy River and the Little River, and also a lot of the backlands of the town of Wells was being conveyed out by that time. Also in 1734, the Wells proprietors confirmed the land. It's my opinion that any piece of property that was deeded out between the beginning of 1640s to sometime around the 1714 time period, when the town started coming together, all of those previous pieces of property were at one time or another confirmed, reconfirmed by either the proprietors or either by the town. And there again, it was something that you had to do as a landowner. You had to go to the meeting and you had to get the land confirmed. The other thing that I saw was that when they granted this land out, that you had 2 years to improve it to a certain amount, to build a house and to clear so much land. If you didn't do it, then your land got reverted back to the town. And the town would then convey that land back to somebody else. Okay, so this is the zoning map for the town, and you can see that all this place called RP, Resource Protection of the Marshes. And you can kind of see that today, nowadays, that all that blank strip of land, which is a beach, is now homes and stuff like that. And so one of the goals of this research project was to take research of some of the current beachfront property back in time to see how it changed and how it performed. And one of the things that happened was, if I took 10 to 20, probably well over 20 pieces of property, scattered about, just out of the thin air, down here, just take them and go back in time. What happens? So you pick up a current deed and you just follow it back in time. And all the time, what happened was you would run into a marsh. That this source of ownership came out of a marsh or an island. There were some islands that were there. There's a question of the number of islands. There's a question of whether or not the islands were owned jointly, and then they were divided up into 2 islands. And so I'm still not 100% familiar with all of the islands. I just know that they exist and I know how they were treated. And anyways, going back in time. You would go back in time to where something was, nowadays, most of the lots are either 50 feet or 100 feet wide. You go back in time, and all of a sudden, it comes out that it's a 4-acre something or other, and you bring that back in time. And most likely, out of dealing with about 20 or so pieces of property, if not all of them, at some point in time, I would get lost. I would hit a dead end. It was Josiah Littlefield's marsh at 4 acres. Well, this is saying 1820. Well, where did he get it from? Well, it's lost. It's not necessarily lost 100%. It's just not, I can't find it without spending a whole bunch of time. And it's almost a process of elimination to figure out going back in time. So what I was able to do was I was able to identify what I could coming back in time and hitting some dead ends. And I was also able to go back in time and bring some things forward. And so there were some able to make some connections. I was able to make some connections down around the Moody Beach area, right around this area here, and Wells Beach in this area here. And what I found was that obviously, back in the time when the coastal areas started to become developed as a summer place, things started changing. Meaning this, a 4-acre marsh would turn out to be a 20-acre chunk of land. So in other words, somebody owned a 40-acre marsh, and they would sell that to somebody else, and they called it 20 acres. And sometimes, if not then, but in the next chain of title coming forward, it would change from seawall to maybe beach, maybe a low water mark, maybe the Atlantic Ocean, or something like that. I'll give you an example. Tibbetts is a guy that back in the late 1800s, 1870 time period, is a guy that bought about 28 or so chunks of land for the beach area. He must have gone to all of these, what I might call long lost heirs, because after a while, the marshes weren't needed to be very valuable. And so they were abandoned by these people. The farms were already made, the fields were already cleared. It was a pain to go down and get marsh lands. And so Tibbetts would go to these people and say, hey, you own the marsh out there, can I buy it from you? And they would buy it, and Tibbetts, out of almost all of his deeds, he would have gotten it from a certain person that he changed, or he had to insert in that deed to the Atlantic Ocean and along the Atlantic Ocean, where you look back in time and that person might have only owned a 4-acre marsh that was bounded by the seawall, or something like that. Here are some of the marshes. And you can see that these are ditches. These lines in here, this is an aerial photo over the tax map line. You can see the ocean here and stuff like that. And quite often these marshes were very, very small, 2, 5 acres, or even less than that, and stuff like that. Here's another series of marshes. And one of the things you can see here, these marshes in here were so wide that it extended from the river to the seawall, and they were so wide based off of a certain amount of acreage. when you look at that width and the acreage, and you figure out, okay, well, where's this acreage come to? The acreage comes to the backside of the seawall. There's a front side seawall and there's a backside seawall. And so by dealing with that, there's been a question that has come up that raises to believe that a 6-acre marsh that's bounded by the seawall could be the backside and not necessarily the front side. But when you follow it forward in time, you'll see that that 6 acres of marshland later on, when they started cutting out little house lots, later on they went to the ocean, or there was a thing called without covenants. We will go along the beach and together with whatever rights we may have to the beach, but we won't warranty or guarantee the ownership that we own to the beach. That's in a lot of the changes. I'm looking back at my notes and I see one thing that I forgot to mention about the proprietors, which I think is very important. In back to the proprietors for a minute. In 1716, when the proprietors were made, they listed 35 men in town to become the proprietors. And they said that these proprietors were the owners of all the unlocated land and all the common land. In 1735, they voted 107 total proprietors. And at that time, they said that all men in said town of Wells that has a house and land within the same shall be a proprietor. Which, in my mind, is telling me that everybody who had a house in the town of Wells is a proprietor, not just an individual person. Now, one of the things I did not do is I do know that around the 1790s or so, the proprietors stopped because all the land was already out into private ownership. So the proprietors did not, wasn't needed anymore. And I did not find, I didn't really look for, I did not see whether or not there was some type of a key document that gave the proprietors the ownership of whatever the proprietors had left over back to the town as a municipality. I'm very familiar with Buxton. And Buxton is a different story. In Buxton, just so to get us something totally different, in Buxton originally was owned by the proprietors, which were 130-something men who were the soldiers of this King Philip's War. These were actually men, and they were in charge of dividing up the land. And after a number of years of Buxton being under proprietors, these men, Buxton became a town. And so the proprietors in Buxton are not the town, or the town is not the proprietors. And there was a time when the proprietors in Buxton gave the town certain portions of the town, what was left over, the roads and stuff like that. So there's a big difference there. I think you guys might know more than I do, but I think this is Moody Beach, I don't know. Anyways, this right in here, obviously, in my mind, is a seawall. And here is the opposite side in the marshes, and it happened to have been in a time period when there was very high tide, one of those lunar tides, when the whole marshes were totally under. And you can see here that this would have been what I call backside seawall. So ultimately, at some point in time, this area of land that we have our homes now, most likely was not necessarily deeded out to an individual person, but have grown over the years by a change of where people perceive the boundaries to be. And it's fairly clear, again, that it's the town of Wells and the inhabitants was the people that were originally granted out this piece of property. Thank you.
So we have about 20 minutes of questions. We have for Robert or Edmund. And I'm sure there are several. And so we will start with that gentleman here, because he has his hand up first.
If you go back to the town lots slide, the old town lot slide that you showed, and say that the grants only went to sort of the upland area, so let's say where Big Daddy's is, okay, just beyond that, and did not go further. Then you say that any grant beyond that was because someone was granted the marsh, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and then if the marsh only goes to the seawall, and that's interpreted as the back that you just showed, that means that all of the properties on Moody Beach and Wells Beach, I don't know about Drake's Island, but please don't belong to the people that have houses there, as long as they're town of Wells, because you're arguing they never had title to the area between that back wall and the front seawall. That's an argument that you could make, is that right?
Yeah, and I think ultimately this is, there's this question of who owns the beach.
No, it's not the beach, it's not the beach, it's the upland, it's the upland you're talking about, it's above the beach that you showed nobody had title to that, the town lots didn't extend to it, the marsh may not have gone there, so whoever conveyed the land that someone's cottage is on, whether it's a back cottage or a front cottage, didn't have title to it. So the town's been assessing it, people have, built houses on it, but your argument is they may not own that land, is that right?
My argument basically is originally that land may have never been conveyed out to anybody. And things have happened since then, and one thing that you should be aware of is title to land transfers by two different ways. One is by deed, and one is by these things called unwritten means. Adverse possession, acquiescence, estoppel. There's all these documents of law that allows boundaries to change other besides the way that the deeds change ownership of it.
So you're not contending that all these people there have been, supposedly
Not at all.
paying high prices for property that no one owns?
Not at all. And then to not to complicate things, but also there's a question about the islands. I didn't really talk about the islands too much. The islands would be perhaps a different scenario because there were a couple of islands that were granted to people from the town, and the islands is different than a marsh because one would argue that the islands were all the way to the low water mark. But what happened was, quite often, is even after the islands were conveyed out, then there was other conveyances made of individual pieces on the islands that only went to the seawall. And one of the things that we understood is that this intertidal zone or the shore of flat areas can be separated. It can be in a separate ownership if that area of land is deemed capable of supporting itself by itself. In other words, if you go along the bold open coast, and if the distance from the upland to the sea is only from here to that wall is not very much, and it's all rocky and stuff like that, And then that particular land is not capable of being separated and supporting itself by itself. Where in this situation here, clearly the beach area, the sand dune areas back in that time period were definitely capable of being used for something, and they were used for something. Travel, animals, there was a lot of grazing that was going on. That's the reason why there was an act to prevent cattle and other animals upon the beaches. The farmers would put all their animals out onto the marshes and out onto the beaches to run during the summertime, and they were destroying them, so they had to, police them and keep them off. Yes.
You said a couple of things that I think may be a little bit wrong. And one is that march is from Buffin's Hill, from south, it went about where Route 1 is, as you said, wheelwright on to the river from 9B Road. He owned a piece of land, plus he owned Moody Point to the sea. And in that deed, I believe that's one that says to the sea, because you went to the rocks instead of sandy beach. And so what ended up happening, by 1700, you were talking about ownership, about all that marsh, because I really spent time playing with that, trying to draw maps. It's almost impossible of what was there. And that marsh was given about, before 1700, about all the marsh that we see left, because above Buffin's Hill, most all of them, when they granted the law, it went to the river. And they owned, that marshland was to the river, the Webhannock River. So all you had left was between the Webhannock River and the seawall. And then you had what was left on down to Gunquit on that, and most of that was all owned. You mentioned Joshua Littlefield. He was the son of John Littlefield, who had the mill on the Gunquit River. And I think his father had got all that land from Moody Point down to the mouth of the Gunquit River. And he got killed by Indians in 1713. And so then his widow was a Hilton, and she married a Malachi Edwards, and they ended up selling it off to different people, that marshland down through there. And then when you talked about what happened after 1700 or so, the marshes, they would write in the deeds 10 acres where you can find it. So it was up to you to find your 10 acres if you wanted, and then the town would accept it. They gave them usually the lot, and then the town hired a surveyor, the proprietors, which was probably a guy with bolts that knew how to read a compass, and they laid the lots out for the people. And so that's how that part is. So that's why after that marsh down at the beach here was about all given away, and the only way you did it is somebody died or wanted to sell a piece. And because I've studied where it went and how it, and that Tibbetts that you mentioned, he went to the state of Maine, and they gave him something like 400 acres of beach. And the people that get that land went to the seawall that Littlefields had before him. But it was interesting. I would say the biggest culprit of giving land in the town of Wells to somebody to the low water mark was the state of Maine. And I don't even know, I only see reason I could think they did it was to clear title.
Without a doubt, yeah. And what he's saying is Tibbetts, who went and collected 28 or so pieces of property for about a 20 or 30 year time period, I think it was around 1906 or something like that time period, got a deed from the state of Maine that included the land basically on Moody Beach area and down by Gunquit Beach and stuff like that, and the term that's in there is the Atlantic Ocean. The person that signed the deed from the state of Maine was a person that was authorized to sell state surplus property. During that time period, there was a lot of land in the state of Maine that was still owned by the state, and they needed somebody to sign over pieces of property that had questionable title. And I would question how the state of Maine themselves got title to it.
Does the state of Maine, in your mind, have a right to take the town of Wells's land and sell it or give it to somebody? Who has the right, if it's the town of Wells's land, and I think the town of Wells thought it was their land?
And that's the reason why I went to the state of Maine, because you could get something from the state, but not the town.
So, in case you haven't realized it, this is Peter Moody, the inspiration for this project. And I would invite folks afterwards, if you don't mind, sticking around after we end the formal, to ask you questions about some of the work that you
Well, I spent hours
Yeah,
on that, so a lot of things, these guys didn't have the time to put in. I was going to Florida for 20 years and sat there every day reading them deeds. So I found out a lot of stuff.
Tremendous amount of work and an incredible resource. I know there was another question back here. Go ahead.
Great job, guys. Let's cut to the chase. The people who own the property on the seawalls own the beach. Do they own it? Can they keep the public on? I say no, based on what you're saying.
Well, that's a good question, and when I saw the flyer that said who owns the beach, it took me a while to figure out what the good answer of that is. And the good answer of that is, tell me a specific area. I mean, you can't just deal with the whole beach, but tell me a specific area, maybe one lot or two lots, and then give me a bunch of money and do some research and stuff like that. But what's important is you cannot convey land of what you don't own. I could give you a deed to a piece of property that I don't own, and it's perfectly, unfortunately, illegal. Okay, I just will quickly to you. And so, if there are deeds that say to a certain line, and it does not say the Atlantic Ocean, or the sea, or the low water mark, then there's easily a question of, well, most likely you're limited to what's in your deed. But also, if you go back in time, does the source of your chain lead you to the same spot? And that's a question that needs to be identified with any place that you want that answer.
My question is pretty much the same. So who owns Moody Beach? I mean, are we allowed to put a chair on that piece of hallowed sand in front of some of these houses?
I think if you have a fishing pole, you can.
I'm sorry.
If you have a fishing pole, yeah.
Okay, just a quick answer to that question. Law stands. We know what the current law is, and we know what the decision was in Moody and in Goose Rocks, and in the McGarvey case, and all the others that have come before us. We have to follow what law is. And I think we have to respect that, regardless of whether or not you agree with it. We are nations of laws, we're a nation of custom. Anglo-American law goes back centuries, and I think we need to respect that, even if sometimes we disagree, and sometimes we have to go to a court to remedy it. So right now, I think we have to follow the guidelines set forth by the Supreme Court and then validated in recent years. Okay, you and then I think we're going to get some.
One comment about the fishing pole. I think below high water, you're absolutely right, fishing, fouling, and navigation. But above the high tide, there's never been any argument that colonial ordinance applies. So if it's high tide and someone comes with a fishing pole, under the law, you could boot them out, and that goes back to 1641, which wasn't adopted until 1647, but it never said above high tide. It only said below low tide. So just to clarify, people ought to
Yeah, that's
look at what the tide is.
This gentleman here?
I'm interested in bringing this up to 2016. In a coastal, the federal government concern, we had a 12-mile limit. Now that's been extended to 200 miles to protect us from the Russian fishing fleet and wherever else. So we know what the 200-mile limit is, and we know what the 12-mile limit was. Where's the ocean? So when I measure 200 miles, you're going to measure high tide, because that's where the ocean goes to, high tide. As far as I'm concerned, the federal government goes from high tide 200 miles out. And this is today. Never mind 1630, 1639, 1713. Today, we own up to 200 miles in the ocean. And where the hell's the ocean?
But just quickly, we're discussing the intertidal area in particular, and Maine law as well as
Talking about the beach.
four other states. Dry sand is, if your deed states it, is dry sand, as this gentleman, Gordon, is that correct, pointed out. It's in the intertidal where a lot of the disputes are. But in Maine, as this is different in Oregon and California and Texas and even Louisiana, that intertidal is actually owned by the state or the people of that particular state. And if it is actually owned by the private landowner, those public trust rights are greatly expanded. It's only in Maine and Massachusetts and one other instance where those rights are really limited, and that's what the Supreme Court handed down in '89, but modified in 2011 with the McGarvey case. So there could be changes in
This is
that.
2016, and we control 200 miles out to sea.
Yeah, that's the easy zone.
Doesn't matter what state it is.
But it is actually
Doesn't matter
from
what
that.
state it is.
Well,
It's the coast of the United States.
the federal government does recognize rights of states when it comes to the coastal ownership. And in the state of Maine, it is the mean low water mark seaward, unless the deed says states that. But I digress just a little bit. You have a question?
I have a question. I'm curious, I'm listening to all those conversations and debates, but how does this research help people of Wales to determine what's good or what's not, if regardless of your research, you cannot answer the question?
Well,
Whether, whether they can use the beach or not, and you still have to apply the law. So what's the point of your research if it doesn't help people of Wales?
yeah, basically, the goal of research was more or less limited in the scope of services. And that was, one, to determine the source of land grants, who originally owned this land and granted the land out. And then to take a sample of beachfront property and follow it through time to find out, did the call for the boundaries change from the seawall or the ocean or something like that? And basically we did that. So it was a small sample to just get a feel for how it might be and stuff like that.
And this is sort of unique. I mean, we decided to pursue this based on Mr. Moody's, all the hard work that he did. I don't think it really has been done. And, knowledge is a great thing, but it is a complicated subject. And it's the excellent job that Ed and Robert has done is only looking at a slice, but you could look at more. But I'm a great believer in exploring. And who knows where it can take you. Our laws evolve, Supreme Court rulings evolve. Who knows what could happen. But I think one of the great things in our country is things do happen slowly. People don't like that. But I think it's a strength of this state and this country is things evolve. It's not revolutionary, it's evolutionary, and I think that adds to stability. Greater happiness, but then again, I'm an optimist. So probably one more question, and then we do have to go. Okay, two. This one back here, and then I'll let you go. Then Robert and Ed will be around to answer questions as well as Peter. So those two more questions.
Okay, what year was the beach made private?
Pardon?
What year was the beach made private?
Well, that, I don't think I can really necessarily answer that because I don't have an opinion of when the beach was made private. That's
It was a court case, wasn't it?
pardon me?
It was a court case?
Well, in 1988 is when there was a major law understanding in the law case, they did not necessarily deal with the title of land. Okay, they dealt with the use and the fish found and navigating in the recreational aspect of it. That's what they dealt with, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
that's right. Yeah, there were two cases, but yeah, it's all more popularly known as the Moody Beach case, known in the courts as Bell versus Tenant Wells, one and Bell versus Tenant Wells two. And that's when, it didn't change the law, essentially, the Supreme Court finally had a case brought by the landowners on Moody Beach in which to render a judgment, an opinion, if you will. And so ever since then, that's been our understanding. But things have evolved and changed a little bit since then, just so you know, if you have to talk to me about it. Okay, we have to go with this gentleman, and then we're going to bring it to a close, and then you're invited to come up afterwards to talk. Go ahead.
I'll add some international perspective. I'm from New Zealand, and about 10 years ago, New Zealand passed the Seabed and Foreshore Act, which basically took the right away from people who claimed they owned the beach in front of their house. Because the beach was open to public access, and even though there was a large protest, in the end, the act was passed, and now we have basically anybody, even without a fishing rod, can access the beach. And one of the principles behind it was that the original population of New Zealand had already, before this, given the right to harvest the beach produce, like shells and everything else like that. And to make this access available to everybody in New Zealand, this Seabed and Foreshore Act was passed. So now everybody in New Zealand owns the beach between high and low tide.
And thus is the difference between New Zealand and here, and certainly Maine. It was what was called the Intertidal Land Act, passed by the legislature, that was ruled unconstitutional in one of the Moody Beach cases. In other words, that act, the Intertidal Land Act, did exactly that, was to greatly expand the uses in the intertidal zone of the public, including recreational uses. But the Supreme Court ruled at that point in time that that was unconstitutional. It was contrary to our Constitution and to our common law. And they threw out the act and left us with fish fouling and navigation. So, and that's the three words we all know, like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So on that happy note, we're going to bring this to an end, and I'd really like to thank everybody.